or cases of companies or others that have used the concept to improve their strategy or performance. Before I invite our guests to reflect on the first question, I'd like to open up the first poll. And just while you're launching that, there we go. So if you could all just respond to this poll. Do you think business has adequate tools and frameworks to measure and report environmental, social, governance, and economic value? Just simply answer totally adequate, somewhat inadequate, or totally inadequate, and submit. And we'll give you a moment to do that. Just while you're voting, I will just share with you, for those who may not have been in the previous session, that there were two polls in the practical session we just had. The first was, do you think business adequately measures and reports on environmental, social, governance, and economic value? 71% said no. And in the second poll, how does business prioritize environmental, social, and economic and governance value? 73% said the economic gets the most value. Just 10% said there's equal value. So you can see now we're sharing the results of this poll, and it looks like it's leaning towards that we still don't have adequate tools and frameworks to measure and report. And obviously we're offering also ourselves some tools and frameworks, somewhat adequate, 36%. So thank you for that. Let me then open up to our discussion, and perhaps I will kick off with Stuart. How has the concept of sustainable value evolved or changed since it was introduced? Maybe you can just recap for us when it was introduced and basically what it is and how it's changed.
Sure, yeah. So the idea of sustainable value kind of emerged from the 90s, I would say. You know, that was the context that it emerged from, and you know, and of course if we take ourselves back to that time, and I think of what was my mindset at that point in time. You know, I was a strategy professor at the University of Michigan at the time, and you know, and I think it'd be fair to say that there was a certain degree of sort of tacit acceptance of kind of the dominant logic of what business was all about back then, which was shareholder value, right? That market fundamentalism and shareholder value had sort of taken over business schools in the 80s, and you know, I think some of us probably lived through that. I being one, and at the time didn't realize the significance, you know, of the idea of market fundamentalism and shareholder primacy, and what impact that had. But it was obviously tremendous, and we only now, you know, kind of in light of, you know, say, having the ability to look back over, say, 30 to 40 years, can see, you know, it's been laid bare, you know, and really clearly now with COVID, the inadequacies, and in some cases even just downright perniciousness of that view of the role of business and how you take account of business. But having said that, that was the context within which, you know, I was thinking about this work. And so my motivation was, how can we begin to think about the social and environmental challenges that we face in that context? You know, that how can those challenges be made business opportunities and actually contribute to the generation of shareholder value? And so that was sort of my motivation in thinking through this idea of sustainable value. And just as a quick recap, you know, so the idea is that even though there's a tendency, even today, to sort of think that shareholder value maximization is really about short-term performance, you know, and you know, earnings per share and profitability only. In point of fact, you know, if you look at long-term value creation, it's much more complex than that. Shareholder value is a multidimensional idea, which certainly includes short-term returns and risk reduction, but it also includes, you know, building reputation and legitimacy. It includes building new competencies and capabilities to innovate so that you just don't fly the current plane into the ground. And it requires that you not only manage today's business well, but create tomorrow's businesses at the same time and create new markets, you know, or else again, eventually the business model that you're able to kind of execute on today simply will not have long-term staying power. Nothing lasts forever. So, you know, the idea then was shareholder value is multidimensional. That includes at least those 4 dimensions. So can we think about the challenges of sustainability in a similar way? You know, that there are challenges that might contribute to short-term cost reduction and risk reduction, like eco-efficiency and waste reduction and so forth. There are elements of sustainability that can contribute to legitimacy and reputation building, things like, you know, product stewardship, sustainable sourcing and product take back, and so now circular economy. There are, and then there are those things that are longer term plays, you know, where it has to do with wholesale acquisition of new inherently clean capabilities, new technologies, regenerative technologies that position you for the future. And then there's finally, there are elements of sustainability that have to do with creating entirely new markets, especially in the underserved space, those who have been, you know, perennially ignored or left behind. What, you know, Prahalad and I wrote a piece called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. That's probably the most apt operationalization of that idea, that there's untapped market space that has growth potential, mostly among those who have been historically underserved. And so that was the idea behind it, right? That we can sort of, in some ways, match sustainability, societal challenges to dimensions that drive long-term shareholder value.
Thanks very much for that quick overview, and maybe we'll follow up with you know, whether that has strengthened as a concept, and whether there are dimensions of the 4 that you think have been stronger and that have been weaker. Let's come back to that. But I'd like to come now to Rob Phillips, because Stu set it up quite nicely, talking about how even sustainable value was kind of a reflection or a reaction against the dominancy of shareholder value. And certainly that's my understanding also of stakeholder value, that it came from a similar place. Can you tell us a little bit about your conception of stakeholder value then, and how you think that may have changed since it was introduced?
Yes, of course. And I neglected in my opening remarks to thank you, Wayne, for the organization, and of course, Katerina and Carolina and all the good people in your shop. So thanks for having us once again. When I was looking back over the videos as instructed, I felt nothing so much as the 18th, 19th century scholars who had to take months in their debates because they were writing letters and shipping them across the ocean. And so I had a little bit of that sensation as I was going through this. How has it evolved? The first thing, well, let me go back to what you and Stu were both emphasizing, because you asked me last time about the business roundtable, and we had published some work on that had given me some pause to think about it. But one of the things that I've been thinking more and more about is that it had an accompanying statement. So when this new statement of corporate purpose was released, it actually came with a news release. And in fact, the news release says, and I'll quote here, "With today's announcement, the new statement supersedes previous statements." That seems like a big deal to me. Yes, I mean, this is not only saying we are completely disavowing shareholder wealth maximization. It's not just that we've got a new thing that we're adding on; it supersedes. And so I wanted to emphasize that before moving on. The other thing that I think is worth noting is that we've gone from a moment of anathema to envy, right? What is it? Success has 1,000 fathers and failure is an orphan. And I had the opportunity to watch a little bit of the Davos screenings yesterday. And it looks like there's now stakeholder theory is what everyone wants to say they've been doing for 50 years now, apparently. So I take that as a good sign. And though they were asking questions about, is there a bubble in ESG? And again, I take that as a good sign. I kind of hope so. It's almost like I'm saving up to be conservative, right? Once we have enough enough heft here that people want to lay claim to it and even use it hypocritically or in some disingenuous way. I take this as a good sign, at least for now, because it's going to be a deeper dive into some of these questions that we're now going to have to take. And that's why, once again, I appreciate the idea behind not repeating what we said last time. With that in mind, there was something that I wanted to drop into the conversation because Kramer and I were close to an exchange when our time ran out last time. And I believe I heard him say that he was reconciling the Porter 5 forces model with the creating shared value by again emphasizing the 1,000 flowers that are now blooming from all of the niche opportunities that have arisen. Again, if I get any of this wrong, please correct me. But it occurred to me as I was thinking this through that these niche opportunities now we have a relationship with a new supplier, a new customer, et cetera. Why doesn't that just push the question of appropriation and exploitation back a level? Now we have this niche relationship, and if he so desires, I'd like to hear Mark's thoughts on why the 5 forces wouldn't then just say, well, now you've got this new niche relationship. Now you need to exploit that relationship. How are we to know who should get how much out of the newly created relationship? And so, just by way of keeping it interactive and pressing just a bit, I will stop there.
Thanks, Rob. Nice intro there, and already raising some questions. So let us indeed come to you, Mark. Initially, maybe just to frame, because I think that, again, I was going to refer to the 5 forces because I think that, certainly Michael Porter came from a very economic space and perspective to start with. And it seemed that shared value was a reframing of that or an expansion of that. And perhaps there has also been changes since the original article was published. And then Rob has also asked something quite specific. So, Mark.
Sure, thank you. So yes, this idea of creating shared value actually our article was published a decade ago, almost to the day. Sure, a lot has changed since then. Part of what has changed has simply been the world moving a bit closer to the thinking that all of us on this call have been putting forth, recognizing the idea that companies having a social purpose can be important to their success economically, and that this division between what is competitive advantage and what is socially responsible is not a hard and fast separation, but in fact there are large areas of overlap where thinking about the social and environmental impact can create new opportunities. When we laid out this theory of creating shared value, we talked about 3 different levels of shared value. The first is around new markets and products. And so, developing solar panels, to pick a trite example, or car batteries, or things that help solve social and environmental problems that create new opportunities for product innovation and for differentiation from competitors. And so in that way, it sort of ties into Porter's framework around competitive positioning. The second level is around rethinking productivity in the value chain. And this could be an example like Nestle or Mars, recognizing that the conditions under which cocoa is grown in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana are not just a social problem, but actually threaten the sustainability of chocolate and cocoa production. And therefore, they have to rethink their relationship, both in their internal operations and their suppliers, to help solve some of the social problems that are threatening their supply chain or adding cost to their operations. And then that too relates to Porter's work around the value chain and how all of the activities a company performs can be aligned to advance its particular competitive positioning in a way that other companies might find hard to copy. The third level of shared value is this idea of strengthening the community in which the company operates or the industry cluster. One example I often use is Cisco, the networking company, which created this networking academy, which now operates in 150 countries around the world, all 50 states in the US, and has trained more than 4 million network administrators, creating tremendous new economic opportunities for people all over the world who didn't have good career prospects, but also eliminating what had been the biggest constraint on Cisco's growth, which was that their customers didn't have enough trained network administrators to hire to support the equipment that Cisco wanted to sell them. So in every case, these three levels of shared value, product, value chain, and community or cluster are really anchored to Porter's strategy concepts. And to Rob's point, I did bring up the five forces because I think what we've seen, and this actually connects back to Stuart's point that nothing is forever and business models need to change, is that there are lots of companies that are operating on business models that were developed when we did not know about social and environmental risks the way we do today. So many companies that operate on business models where we didn't know that pollution created climate change and that this was an existential threat, or that eating salt, fat, and sugar was in fact bad for your health. And so as our awareness of social and environmental needs and risks grows, regulation changes, competitive positioning changes, customer requirements and desires change, and companies are faced with a very difficult challenge of whether they are able to rethink their business model based on the five forces as they operate today, taking into account social and environmental influence, or whether they are stuck with their original business model when they didn't know about these things and so didn't build them into their operations. And so I think one shift we've seen and one evolution of the thinking is to understand that as our awareness of social and environmental needs and problems grows, it changes the conditions under which businesses operate. And particularly for public companies, there is a tremendous challenge of how do you maintain your earnings and keep your shareholders happy while shifting to a new business model that takes into account social and environmental issues as we understand them today.
Thanks, Mark.
I'll stop there, yes.
Yeah, that's a great framing. And, I like that you brought in the business models angle. I guess some might say that it's not that we haven't known, that we've known actually for quite a long time, but that at least it hasn't mainstreamed, or we could argue that since the 1970s, at least, we've known that some of these consequences that we're now facing. But we'll come back to that. Let me give Jed Emerson a chance now. So far what we've been talking about is questioning or reframing the purpose of the corporation. And I like that you also draw it wider to talk about the purpose of capital, and this links to blended value. So do you want to just tee that up for us?
Sure. Well, first off, I always hate going after all these guys because every one of them says things that I find exciting and challenging and I want to engage with. So this is going to be a great conversation. Let me start, though, with kind of picking up with Stuart's frame around, I think it's really critical that as we talk about these issues, we understand not only how these ideas and practices have evolved, but what they came out of. What kind of led to the place where we even began to think that you could consider economic value and performance as separate from social and environmental issues. And I find it amusing that the Business Roundtable used the term supersedes, all that's come before. And I think that reflects the arrogance of the business community and this idea that in fact, modern financial capitalism is the way. And I think a lot of our understanding about the nature of value, in my case, is fully grounded in being a white male American and looking out at the world from that kind of Western dualistic perspective. And everything that comes kind of builds out of that frame. And so when I first started, I had a previous career in community and youth development. When I left that and started running a fund that invested in, took philanthropic capital, invested in market-facing companies that were owned by nonprofits seeking to provide transitional employment to formerly homeless people, we just kind of fell right into the middle of this divide between, do you have to either make money or give it away? Do you do well or do you do good? And is the role of business to generate maximum shareholder value, or is it to do other things in the world? And I think that it's interesting because we always begin with this assumption that our perspective is correct. I mean, where you stand depends on where you sit. And I think that I was in a webinar the other day with a colleague from Japan, and halfway through, she basically said, well, the basic problem here is Japanese have a fundamentally different understanding of the role of the corporation and capital. And it is to be supportive of, the society and the community and family, whereas the Western, mainly Wall Street perspective is capital reigns supreme and whoever has the gold rules, right? And those are two very different kind of assumptions. And so when I came into this process of managing our fund and would look at the business schools and the dominant practices that were being taught, it was with this idea that the purpose of capital is to seek its highest and best use, which meant that wanting to generate the greatest financial return for the best mix of risk and liquidity. And that's really what this was about, right? And the problem was that all of this falls apart in practice. I mean, we have known for years that the place of business is about a lot more than simply making money. And when I gave talks at Davos on blended value in 2000, 2001, 2002, I remember having a German businessman stand up and say, this is all great. I totally support everything you're saying, and none of this is new. This is how we've run our family business for 150 years. And so I think that we need to recognize that this whole conversation is really a function of interlocking social constructs where we each as professionals and then as a field are kind of grappling with this fundamental kind of question of Western dualism and the idea that these things are separate as opposed to whole. And so when I look at the evolution of where this conversation is today versus where it was before, what I think we are the aberration, right? This is not like kind of creating something new. We're returning to what we used to know. And if you think about the perspective of many Asian communities, you think about, as I said, the Japanese perspective, you think about First Nations and indigenous peoples, you think about the Oneida community in upstate New York that was created as a business to create sustainable revenue for a community that was living a life that was antithetical to the mainstream at that point. We have always known that business should be better in this way. And what we're doing now is simply righting the ship. We have gone horribly this way, and now we're just coming back to the natural order. And so that's what we're struggling with is how do we take our dysfunctional frameworks and this idea that Wall Street and Silicon Valley frameworks are reality and move beyond that and get back to the true reality. And so for me, looking at blended value, that's what this journey has been about, is at the end of the day, recognizing for each of us as individuals, as fiduciaries, as entrepreneurs, the nature of value is fundamentally whole. It is non-divisible, and we're being forced by this system to choose sides. And so all of this is basically trying to accommodate that choice as opposed to rejecting it and saying, actually, there's a different way we should be thinking about this. So let me just stop there.
Great, thanks, Jed. I'll just respond by briefly also reflecting on how I see this coming from an integrated value perspective, and then we'll open up to also respond to each other. I think some points have already been raised. So it builds nicely on what you've all been saying, which is that the reason value has our traditional view of value has not worked is because it has been fragmented, it has been disintegrated. In fact, even the idea of the triple bottom line or ESG, I mean, we're still talking about these silos. And so a lot of my work was trying to say, how could we apply a systems thinking perspective to value? And what was clear was that many of the world's standards, many of the world's thought leaders, among them yourselves, were asking for integration, but not too many were saying how to do that. And when I looked at the world through a systems thinking lens, what I ended up with was integration at three levels. One is integration of, if you like, the challenges. So to really start understanding which elements of society are breaking down. And in my case, I framed that as 5 breakdowns. And then to start to see the interrelationship between them. That's really the most critical thing. So what's the link between disparity and disruption, as we're seeing now through COVID? Or what's the link between degradation of the environment and health and well-being, or inequalities? So it's at that level, and then I think it's about integration at the level of solutions. So fundamentally, I think the real breakthrough in value creation is when you integrate the solutions. So when you have a smart, let's say a technological solution that's also sustainable. This was also, I think, already in your framework, the idea of it, Stu. Or when you have a resilient solution that is also inclusive. So it's when we have these innovations that start to deliver multiple benefits across these areas of breakdown and turn them into breakthroughs. So that's the second level of integration. And the third level is more of a how-to. It's like, how do I as a company then practically integrate all of these issues and these responses, these solutions into my company? And so there are 7 steps, if you like, or areas, and these are not rocket science. It's integrating in terms of understanding your context, in terms of listening to your stakeholders, integration through your values, through your strategic goals, your KPIs, your measures, the innovation process, and your policy response. So I think we are, in that sense, speaking a similar language, but I'm keen now to start to have a conversation. So I'll invite you first, if there are any responses to what's been said in the introduction, something that sparked for you, anything you agreed or disagreed with, and I'll firstly open that. Yes, Stu.
So just to come back to Jed's observation, which I think is really important, that in some way, I like, Jed, the idea that we are the aberration is really an important insight and observation, that really what we're talking about is sort of Anglo-American style capitalism for the last 40 years, right? That, and even more specifically, public companies, right? In that context, right? That even in America, there are family businesses and privately held businesses and co-ops and all kinds of other governance structures that take a very different and more integrated view. So we're really talking about Anglo-American capitalism in the public markets, of the last 40 years, because even if you go back further, of course, in history, even American style capitalism in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s looked very different, right? It was, back to the days of, Burl and Means, and the work back then where, they correctly observed that when you have diffuse shareholders, rather than seeing it as a problem of agency, that it's really managerial capitalism, and that managers, ought to take precedence because they're the ones creating the value. Their famous quote that shareholders, in diffuse, public companies with diffuse shareholders neither invest not, manage not, nor do they accept liability. So why should they be given primacy? They contribute nothing. And in the public markets today, in the public capital markets, they're really capital negative, right? When you consider that the vast majority of it is just secondary trading. There are some IPOs, but stock buybacks by far wash that away, right? So the public market is capital negative when you come right down to it. So why should shareholders be given primacy? It is a strange aberration that we live in, and in terms of American style kind of shareholder primacy driven capitalism. And there's nothing, it's simply a convention It's a, it's a social construction, and social constructions can be changed, and they have changed throughout history.
Yeah, go on, Rob.
Yeah. So just to be clear, I'm pretty confident that we all agree on the pretty bulk of what we're talking about here. So I wanted to lay that out there because I also believe strongly in the immanent critique. That is to say, steel sharpens steel, and we need to be as tough on each other as we are on people who aren't in the room. And so please take it in a spirit of constructive, what I'm getting ready to say. One of the other things that I enjoy studying is what we're calling historic corporate social responsibility. And one of the things that, a quick breeze through history will demonstrate, for example, is that the business model, the critique of the business models has been around for centuries. I need, for the pollution thing, obviously we can go back to something like Silent Spring, Rachel Carson, and certainly we can go back to the Burleigh means, and we can go back to Karl Marx, and we can go back to Adam Smith even. And so these critiques have been out there. And as a matter of fact, entertainingly enough, with the since Mark mentioned the salt and fat, and yet it turns out that the tobacco companies poached the communications people from Big Sugar. Right. So the idea that we didn't know what was going on and these business models were somehow bad against our knowledge and judgment is something I would not want to have reflected on this conversation 50 years from now. So let me put that into context. I do worry. I don't. And so I'll come back to Wayne and systems very quickly. The systems thing. To what extent is a systems perspective also used by some people to throw up their hands, can't win, why try? It's way too big and we can't really get a grip on it. And so I do have some concern about that. But this is all in the spirit of saying, how will we know when we've overplayed our hand in this conversation? What are the limits of business's responsibility? Oh, by the way, Jed, yeah, I think the Olympus scandal and Fukushima also would a little bit of critical perspective on our eastophilia, right? But with all that said, I guess the question that I would like to pose in general for whomever would like to answer is, are there any parts of this conversation that you believe we are going to be ashamed of in 10 years? Where we've grossly overplayed our hands because we are in a moment of striking while the iron's hot, metaphorically speaking. And so that's where I would like to get whatever comments are available on where you guys disagree with each other or other prominent theories.
So let me just hop right in. There are so many areas we could go with this, but I'll just start with one, which is I think that what will fundamentally undercut this process is the notion that we can know. We lack so much humility in this process. And in part, it's driven by advisory firms that are paid lots of money to come in with the answer and to basically say, here's what you should do. And what we need to understand is we have to approach this from a place of co-creation, mutual inquiry, and humility in terms of not knowing, because what we know, as we already said, that what business knew 30 years ago, 60 years ago, 100 has all changed. It's all iterative. It's all bound within the frame within which we live our own lives right now. And so I'm sure, I have every confidence that in 10 years, not even like 5 years, but people will look at this and say, wow, those folks were so off base, and maybe this part was helpful or this part contributed to forward motion, but overall it's like, whoa, like they really missed the mark. And so I think that's part of my frustration is I feel like everybody rushes to the answer and then you end up arguing about, is it blended value? Is it shared value? Is it integrated? Is it sustainable? And that's just within this conversation, right? And much less in the broader kind of business community. And it's tricky because I'm an advisor. I get paid to tell people what they should think or how to frame this or this kind of, it is kind of like my bread and butter. And it's really awkward to say to somebody, you know, actually, this is a process of inquiry that's going to unfold for like 5 or 20 or 30 years, right? I mean, it's like people don't want to hear that. They want the easy answer. They want the checklist. They want the bulleted metrics. And I think at the end of the day, I get it. And all of that undermines our ability to create sustained value over the decades.
I think as well, I like this, this challenge. And one of the things we may be slightly embarrassed about is perhaps that our approach is so helicopter view that it's hard to tell between a company that is or isn't creating value, because it could be quite easy for almost any company today to take any of our models or framings and say, yes, we do a bit of that, we do a bit of that, we do a bit of that, and therefore, of course, we're creating value. And so to me, at the moment, what we're lacking are real thresholds or rules that say, this is definitely value destruction. And this is the line which you cannot cross as a company. And I just think, I mean, of course, we've had the notion of let's take donut economics, maybe getting us one step closer, where at least you've got planetary boundaries with you know, numbers on it. You've got social foundation. But in speaking to Kate Raworth, I mean, it hasn't been applied to companies yet. We really struggle to do that. So long as we're providing just concepts or boxes that people can easily fill by doing a bit of everything, I think we lack the sharp edge that actually differentiates between those that genuinely are creating value and those that are still destroying massive value. Mark.
Yeah, no, I would just agree with that. And, you know, it's interesting. I'm doing some work with the World Benchmarking Alliance, which is set up by the UN Foundation to evaluate companies' commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. And they're going industry by industry, looking at 2,000 leading companies around the world, including those based in emerging markets as well as developed. And what they found, industry by industry, is despite all these wonderful sustainability reports and commitments and so on, almost no companies in the world are actually on the path to delivering on their stated commitments around the Sustainable Development Goals by a huge margin. I mean, it's not even close. And we've done some deeper analysis with a few companies saying, you know, here's their business model and their business projections, and here's their sustainability claims and their sustainability goals. And there is no way to reconcile the two. You just can't, on the existing business and growth trajectory, ever hope to reach your stated goals. So this idea of companies claiming credit, whether it's any one of our theories or anything else, for actually being, you know, positive contributors to society, is a huge problem. And it's part of the noise that confuses everybody when we get into this conversation, because, you know, everybody can point to a company that claims to be doing this or claims to be doing that and is not, in fact, doing it or is creating harm. And so the ability to measure the actual impact of companies is critical on both social and environmental areas. In environmental, the measurement is reasonably good, but in social, it's really far behind. And also the necessity of communicating that to shareholders and the economic value. Just one quick story, and I'll pass the mic back, as it were. But we're working with an Italian power company, Enel. And they found that as they shift to renewables, their profitability actually increases, that the power generation from renewables is more profitable than from fossil fuel. They've made a great deal in their sustainability reports about their shift to renewables. They never thought to mention to their investors that as they shift to renewables, their EBITDA will increase, because their mindset was this: we're doing this for sustainability, and they never connected the two. And part of that just had to do with organizational structure, that the sustainability folks didn't connect with the finance and the investor relations people. And so even when there's a good story to tell, companies aren't figuring out how to tell it.
Yep. Rob. And then
fantastic example, in fact, because it fits nicely with my number one, that hypocrisy is probably a good thing in some ways, because at least they've set these goals and now can be held to account for failing to achieve them. Apparently, of course, the governments have also around the world have done no better. And so this speaks to the point of goals in general. You know, from OB, that goals need to be challenging, but eventually achievable. And so I think that this is in some ways one of the exact kinds of things I'm talking about, where we might be overplaying our hand, because there will come a time, if we keep finger wagging and scolding companies, where they're going to say, can't win. Once again, I don't want to play this game anymore. You guys go over there. And that would be a loss for everyone as well, because then the lever of hypocrisy is no longer available to us. And so that would be a really good example of something that I would recommend. And it's consistent with what Jed was saying as well about humility. Let's make something challenging, but good God, we got to get a W out of this at some point in the next decade.
Okay, Stu?
Yeah. I think Mark makes such an important point, such an important point, that at least in my humble estimation, you know, kind of thinking about the sustainable value model, like over the last 20 plus years, and the companies that I've worked with, and if I observe what's going on today, the reality is most, you know, large public companies, global companies, have significant headway when it comes to eco-efficiency and waste reduction, and increasingly in the product stewardship realm, especially in terms of sustainable sourcing, and a bit when it comes to, you know, product take back or redesign, you know, and so forth. They have made substantial progress on those, but those all have to do with incrementally reducing negative impact in current businesses and within the existing business models of those companies. So they've done that, and then they've stacked on top of it, you know, these sort of hyperbolic, grandiose statements of purpose and sustainability goals, you know, looking out to 2030, that they're going to somehow transform the world, you know, with these, you know, just totally over the top grandiose statements on their websites and so forth. And to your point, Mark, you know, if you take that, but then actually climb inside the companies and look at what's actually happening in terms of strategy setting, investment, you know, their operating plan and so forth, there's no connection, you know, between what they're actually doing and those 2030 hyperbolic, you know, grandiose goals. And therein lies the problem, right? It has not just become what the company does, to Jed's point, right? It's still sort of a silo off to the side. It's the sustainability people writing the sustainability report and setting the sustainability goals versus, you know, what are the corporate goals, right? That's the real question.
Well, and so let me just,
yeah, go on, Jed.
No, I was just going to say, I think that because of that, we're in this, we're stuck, because it has to be a both and solution. Like, on the one hand, these are real companies that are in motion right now, hiring people, deploying capital, I mean, the whole 9 yards. And so we've got to manage that process and try to help those folks move in a different direction, in the same way that in the capital markets and the impact investing space, we're trying to do the same thing from the capital side. And we have to recognize that this all takes place within what is fundamentally an extractive economic model, that the system itself is predicated on taking value from one place and aggregating it in another. And that is, I mean, we've got to really understand that that is the broader frame within which all of this is unfolding. And so we need the donut economics. We need the broader kind of regenerative circular economy. We need all of that, you know, to be out in play at this level, at the same time that we're kind of pulling that into practice. And I would encourage people, prior to this session was another session on, you know, what are companies actually doing in terms of reporting and management, all this. And I was struck because on the one hand, it was brilliant. Like, it was the kind of thing that I listen to today and it just makes my head explode, because like 30 years ago, 20 years ago, we were talking about like, how would you do this? What would that look like? And we'd have all these, and man, people are so far ahead of what it was that we were talking about 10, 20 years ago, let's say. And that's wonderful. And at the same time, I think we're at danger. Martin Luther King talks about the risk of having guided missiles and misguided men. And I think that we're going to get so good at the metrics and the structure and the execution, and we're going to just fly right off the cliff and not have a fucking clue like what happened. And it's going to be like, wait a minute, we've never really asked these fundamental questions of purpose and structure and sustainability. Wayne, I'm sorry, back to you.
Yeah, no, I can link to that nicely, because one of the things I'm wondering is whether the frameworks, or more specifically the tools and so on that we're bringing to the market, and there are now plenty. I mean, we had the Value Balancing Alliance presenting their very interesting methodology, ABN AMRO, World Economic Forum, all of these are putting forward their methodologies, but I wonder if we're just playing into that same business model. So if you can try to convert everything to a financial number, for example, yeah, we might get a picture then that says, okay, we're destroying X amount of environmental value and we're creating X amount of social value. But I just wonder if we're playing into the hands of the same business model, which is that it's all about, in the end, it's all about the money, and we can measure everything by money. So I'll put that out there, but I'd like to also respond on the point of the systems and whether a systems view on this is helpful or not. I think that when we think of systems, we sometimes get overwhelmed. That's true, but that's also a misunderstanding of how systems work. So we probably do need the counterbalance in the system, that it's not what's coming from business or the big four, but it's also what's coming from social movements and from government and other players. So I think what's missing a little bit in this discussion is value is what society decides it is. Value reflects the norms of society. And so that's what needs to shift. And actually it is what's shifting, but we just haven't really articulated extremely well what those values are that we're expecting. We know we're expecting more from companies. But the way that complex systems work, and why I'm a little bit more optimistic perhaps than you, Rob, is that you don't have to understand the whole system. You don't have to try to influence the whole system. You only have to have this common set of norms or visions, or let's say global societal goals, and then the system self-organizes. And all you have to do is work with your own network, work with your local context. You don't even have to know who else is working on the same issue. And experiments that have been done in society with that kind of flocking behavior suggests that you only need between 5 and 25% of people who are aligned to shift a whole crowd. And so I think we sometimes get overwhelmed for the wrong reasons, perhaps. If you look at a termite colony, there's no leader there, but they're doing very complex things. Okay, Rob.
Yeah, that's really good. So first of all, for the record, I'm pathologically optimistic. So I actually do think you're onto something. I just want to sharpen us all. But I'm glad that you mentioned sort of social values are what society says they are, because to me, the thing I'm having the most trouble getting across right now is the idea of explicit attention to ethics, values, norms, these kinds of things. There's an enormous amount of pushback to normative talk in this regard, as if this is all very scientific and has a one right answer solution to it. Because to me, you're talking about self-organizing, and I think to some extent it is. I believe that ethics and values, there's no greater coordination mechanism in the history of mankind than ethics and values. And you can have, obviously physical coercive force is right up there, but that's has its own problems. I think that the market, to your point, supply demand curves is in its way self-organizing, and there are other self-organizing systems. But in general, things like norms and values have organized societies since time immemorial. And the idea that we don't talk about this, as if we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back, if we're not explicitly talking about what values we have as an organization, what we stand for, what we won't do in light of those values. And so this, to me, since you brought it up, I want to make a plea that we become more conversant without feeling morally attacked somehow or personally attacked, that we become more conversant and if, dare I say, even more learned in the classics of moral and political philosophy, East and West, North and South, et cetera, and use that for its coordination value within and between organizations.
So, yep. Rob, is there a difference between value and values, and or are values subsumed within a consideration of the nature of value?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those questions. I hesitate to get into definitional questions. I find them more, frankly, distracting unless you tell me, why we're using this particular, why it's necessary that we more closely define it. But with that said, I will say that it's why I said on the poll that we took in the prior session, I said economic value, because the truth is asking about prioritization, environment, social, economic. I think asking about prioritization itself feeds into the very disintegration that we're trying to overcome. They are all mutually informative. Economic is social. Social is environmental, and so on through the permutations. And so that's why sometimes just stop asking the bad questions, the misdirecting questions, I think is no small thing as someone who's been in a business school for a few decades.
Yeah, Stuart.
And Rob, to your point, if we come back to the public equities market, right, and the idea of what drives stock price is a social construction entirely, right?
It's Reddit today.
It can just because we have 3 or 4 decades of MBAs been perpetrated on the world that share price should be driven by quarterly earnings. That's just simply a social construction, right? And we could decide, societally, that it should be a bunch of other values that should drive share price. There's no, especially in the public market, right? Corporations should be considered institutions. So why shouldn't stock price be driven by things like reinvestment rate, rather than stock buybacks, or employee living wage, or carbon footprint, or any variety of things? That there's no reason whatsoever why those kinds of things couldn't drive stock price in the public markets. And I think it's up to us just to simply change people's minds, right? And business schools really, I view business schools really as the root cause of all of this. American business schools specifically, and the American MBA model has tragically infected most of the rest of the world. So it's time for us to change the way we teach business.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that if I can just jump in. And it's painful to be teaching at business school right now. But I do think, the problem with the word value and values is that there really are 2 very different meanings. And there is economic value, and that's fairly simple. And when we talk about shared value for the company side, we do think about economic value. Then you get into values and what is important in a society or in the world or to individuals. And that's, of course, highly variable and subjective. And ultimately, I think that set of the values have to be determined by government, ideally by democratic government, because you kind of have to permit companies the right to do whatever is legal. And, I recall talking to some CEOs of, major global companies who said, you talk about values, but I operate in 150 different countries. There are radically different values across those different countries. Whose values am I supposed to be following? And so I think at some point we need to bring government in, and the failure of government, frankly, around much of the world, to stand up for the values that need to constrain business and define these non-economic requirements of business in the interest of a healthy society.
Can we agree, though, that government lags, right? So these values emerge, I guess, and get debated and emerge in movements and protests and all kinds of other things. And it usually takes maybe decades even for the government to finally institutionalize that. Of course, in some cases, what governments institutionalize are not good values at all. Apartheid was a legal system. But I tend to agree. I think that sort of creates a level playing field on what the new minimum requirement is. But that's not where the change comes from. At least that's not where the change is seeded. Yes, Rob.
I just think it leaves a lot of the organizational value I was describing on the table. Telling me what not to do is the floor, and it's not particularly aspirational, right? So to me, what I mean about values is this is what we stand for. And I do sympathize trying to travel values. I mean, we've been talking about this for decades as well, about, you know, when in Rome versus when in Rome, Georgia. And this is why it is a competitive advantage, frankly, is finding that secret sauce to maintaining your integrity and your own authentic values as you travel is not something that can be bought off of a shelf. And once we have that as a coordination mechanism, this just is what we stand for. That's the more proper, the more appropriate, the more aspirational use of values that I just don't think government is ever going to replace.
Okay, I'll let you respond briefly, Stu, and then we're gonna move to questions from the chat. So please do continue to contribute there, and we'll come to Carolina. And I also want to just reflect, how do we take the values we're talking about and not make them motherhood and apple pie? In other words, it has to be something that changes behavior and that there are lines that won't be crossed. Stu.
So I think the role of government is not only fair game, but really, really important, right? I think as both Rob and Mark are suggesting. And again, I think if we look at it in the context of sort of American style neoliberalist capitalism over the last 40 years, part of the mindset, has been to delude us into thinking that government is just simply incompetent and can't get things done. I mean, that's really been in the American context, that's been part of the formula, of economic liberty is government's incompetent, and to denigrate it, to drown it in a bathtub, and that really only private sector solutions are efficient. I think that's been part of the gospel that we've been led to believe. When again, history belies that. If even in the United States, if you look back in time, we can find eras when government really led, right? When government led investments, when government led in the middle of the 19th century, building railroads, the Homestead Act, and on into the 20th century, in the post-World War II years, government really was a positive force, was a co-creator of sustainable prosperity, right? That private sector could have never done what it did in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s had it not been for far-sighted government investment in the 50s and 60s. So I think we have to shed the idea that somehow government's always going to be retrograde and restore the rightful place of government as a partner in the co-creation of sustainable prosperity.
Thanks, Stu. With some question marks over state capture and lobbying and so on, or some concerns, I guess. I'd like to come to you now, Carolina, because you've been keeping an eye on the chat. And can you give us any of the themes that might be emerging or any specific questions you'd like to put to the panel?
Yes, indeed. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, there has been a lot of comments and reflection in the chat from our participants. Many of them were reflecting on this, let's say, Western view of business, and also that there should be maybe a rethinking of it. Some were also mentioning that we should all go back and read again Peter Drucker. So there were some references to that. And also a lot of discussion about values. So what is value? Shall we invent some subjective metric system and integrate it in the monetary metrics that we have? There were also values about countries in which a stronger regulation should apply when corporates do business in countries with weaker regulation. So these were, let's say, the main topics that came out from the chat.
Thanks, Carolina. I mean, I think we can have a long discussion about values, and maybe we might also over discuss it. But it does seem to me like everything that we've been trying to do in this movement has been about trying to articulate first and increasingly trying to measure the things that we find are important, whether it's climate change or diversity and inclusion. So I think we're trying to do this. The question is just, are we being successful, and what are we struggling with? And so perhaps I could sort of focus us in a little bit on that second question we had, which is, you've seen companies working also with your frameworks or with the concept of a broader value. What has been difficult? What hasn't worked? How might your concepts or frame even have been abused and just applied superficially to suggest that value is being created where it's really not? So would anybody like to kick us off on that?
Yeah, sure.
Mark.
I can. I mean, I think our concept has been abused plenty. You know, the challenges in working with companies are several. First is this fundamental mindset shift to say that you know, social benefit and economic profit are not opposites, are not contradictory. There's an immediate tendency when business leaders are considering social issues to remove their business analytics hat and simply look at it in terms of reputation, or, you know, what is good or bad in some sense. And that's creates a huge problem, because you then miss the opportunities for better economic performance through positive social impact, or the risks of failing to address social and environmental problems to the future of your business model. So that mindset shift is really hard, and we keep running up against it. You know, I think a second area which has been a real area of abuse, frankly, I'll say, has been ESG measurement. First of all, it is this, you know, extensive checklist of things, most of which are not material to the success of the company, and frankly, most of which are not the company's most material success, or impact rather, on the planet and people. And so you find, you know, banks reporting on their carbon footprint, but not saying anything about subprime loans, or other examples like that. And then you run into the fact that so much of the ESG data is self-reported and is not necessarily true. I mean, you run into Volkswagen with the emissions scandal and others. And so while it's wonderful to see the momentum that ESG investing is having at the moment and the kind of resurgence of interest, it's also very, very frightening, because the ESG metrics and systems that are out there, by and large, are highly unreliable, contradictory, and frankly misleading. And so again, that's one of my greatest fears, is that all of this positive energy around ESG is actually not going to result in taking investors and businesses where they need to go.
Yeah, Rob?
Yeah, so I had this conscious moment. It took me several days, I would even say, back in my doctoral studies, where I was trying to decide whether or not to hitch my academic star to stakeholder theory, or what I was doing was sufficiently distinct to name my own brand and move on from there. And I still see quite a few, to your point, I still see quite a few sort of benefits and drawbacks to either choice. I obviously chose to try to polish and refine a somewhat baggage-laden concept of stakeholder theory, I think it's safe to say, and you know, never looked back. But with that in mind, I do wonder to what extent, if any of the panelists went through a similar thought process, and what they think about, in general, the let 1,000 flowers bloom and see who wins kind of proliferation versus settling on some set of theoretical constructs, metrics, etc., that we can then begin to apply, heaven help me, normal science to.
Yeah, and I think that reflects also one of the questions in the chat. Huh? Should we come up with one unifying theory of value creation? I can have a first response, and then Stu, I'll bring you in. I mean, I actually would not favor that. I think that it is in the diversity of perspectives that something emerges, but it's not something prescriptive. It's not something that says, okay, now this is the model that everybody should use. I mean, we have to remember that even shareholder primacy is not written down somewhere or codified as one person's idea. It's emerged as an idea, and people have bought into it over time. So to me, it's the underlying ideas or values, if you like, that emerge and people buy into and then put their own framing on, their own measures on. That's back to this organizing principles of the complex system. If you get at a certain level the common goal or buy into an idea, that's what shifts the system, because then people self-organize behind that idea rather than a particular set of metrics or framing of the concept. Stu, what do you think?
Well, again, I think the last 30 or 40 years, of the rise of the logic of shareholder primacy, and then the mathematical rigor that underpins it, right, kind of there's a veneer of objectivity and and there's quantitative rigor to it, right, which makes it persuasive, especially in an academic environment. Whereas, kind of faculty or those looking at it through a different lens, whether it's, a more psychological or behavioral lens, or a sociological lens, or an ethics lens, can't model it with calculus, right? So there's this sort of this veneer of rigor and simplicity to the idea of shareholder primacy, and efficient markets and agency theory, that I think have been its prime attraction, right? That it in some ways it just makes life much simpler. If you have to really do is pay attention to one variable, as in terms of an objective function. But of course, we know the truth is much more complex than that, Wayne, as you're suggesting, right? I mean, we're talking about complex systems here. So we have to shed the idea that the objective function of business, that there can be any one thing to maximize. I mean, I think that's just complete bunk. And we somehow have to free ourselves of that way of thinking, that business is about trying to optimize many things simultaneously. And the objective function is multidimensional. And that requires a different headset. And I think that's what we have to get to.
Great.
I think
Jed,
some of this,
yes, and then we'll go to Mark.
Some of this has to do with your theory of change. And, the fact is, this conversation, broadly speaking, has been helped by having different folks say, here's a concept, here's an idea, I'm putting it out there, and then other folks kind of either embrace it or not. And I would go back to this idea that I do believe that value is fundamentally whole and non-divisible. And that's all I really care about. When I first started talking about blended value in the late 90s and then publishing in 2000 and beyond, I had the folks who had funded my research said, you should launch the Blended Value Institute. And so we'll give you money to create this center that you can convene people and promote your ideas and all this stuff, right? And I was like, my first question was, are you going to endow it? And so I don't have to fundraise. And if I have to fundraise, I'm putting myself in a position where I'm fundamentally undermining what it is I'm trying to say. And what I was trying to say was that we have to rethink our understanding of organizational form and the purpose of capital. And for me to create a new organization that I would then have to compete against other people's organizations for capital around in order to advance the premise that we need to rethink organizations made absolutely no sense. And so I think that on the one hand, yes, we need to have these ideas, we need to brand them. The danger is that you end up having these ridiculous arguments around, is it shared value? Is it blended value? Is it sustainable? And it's to this point of kind of taking you off focus. This is the thing. And so for better or worse, quite frankly, most of my career has been spent finding folks that I think are advancing various aspects of blended value and slotting in behind them And I don't care what they call it, really, right? Whatever works for them. And I don't want to be in a position where I have to, again, I go back to this notion of co-creation. And I can't co-create if I'm pitching you on the validity of my idea and aren't I brilliant and all this stuff, right? And again, the more you read and the more you sit in the flow of humanity and history, the more you realize that none of this is new. There is absolutely nothing that we're talking about today that hasn't been the focus of human inquiry for centuries and centuries and centuries. So in any event, so that's my take on, I would slot in behind anything. Integrated value sounds good to me. I'm kind of like, it's very broad and inclusive. I'll follow Wayne. I mean, also Chairman Mao said the leader is somebody who finds a parade and goes to stand in front of it. And I think all we're doing is, this is the flow of history. This is where capitalism is today. I'm just happy to be marching along and somewhere maybe near the middle. I'm not sure where I am anymore, given how much has happened in the last years, but there you go.
Thanks, Jed. Mark.
Well, I completely agree with Jed in that first, I don't care what you call it, and second, that we are marching within a very large parade, wherever we may be within that line. I just wanted to add to Stuart's point that the attraction of the shareholder primacy is not just its simplicity, but it reminds me of the Mark Twain quote about how hard it is to explain something to a man whose livelihood depends on not understanding it. Yeah. And there is so much money that has been made by so many CEOs and investors that there is a very, very strong cohort of people who are deeply opposed to any change to this shareholder primacy notion, and it goes to Jed Emerson's theory of change issue. And that is just a huge, huge barrier to get people, and CEOs in particular, to walk away from the immense payday that comes from the stock options and short-term performance. Yep. And playing the investor quarterly earnings game, however rigged those numbers might be. It doesn't lead to good corporate governance, but it certainly creates an incredibly strong incentive structure for the CEO.
Yeah, huge vested interests and inertia in the system, right? Which is what we've been struggling against. So as we start to end bringing this into focus in the last 10 or so minutes, I would just like to bring us down from the stratosphere where I know we like to play, and just reflect perhaps on an example of where you think your concept of value creation has been adopted or has added value. So because these are not just theoretical concepts we're playing with. There are companies that are, whether they call it by these labels or not, that are enacting these different forms of value and are benefiting, many of them, from it. We could have a discussion about Tesla and why it's valued so highly when it makes so few cars, and whether that is a reflection really of the value they create for future society. That's a different discussion, perhaps. So who'd like to kick us off? And we'll do a sort of a quick round of examples, really, of can this stuff be made practical? Is this any good for real companies in real economies? Yes, Jed.
I'll just shoot right in. I have 3 quick examples right off the top. I think one would be the whole B Corp movement and all of the work that's going on in that community that really builds on previous generations of folks, the Body Shops, the Patagonias, those folks. And so I think that's an example of people intuitively moving toward what they know in their gut as business people is a better way to think about and execute business strategy. On the capital side, I would point to the network called Resource Generation, which is a set of inheritors who are completely blowing up the notion of fiduciary duty and that the purpose of capital is to create more capital and save it for yourself. These are folks who are looking at a variety of different strategies to deploy their wealth that really kind of blow the doors off of a traditional understanding of fiduciary duty. And, for better and worse, I think there are going to be a lot of kind of lessons in that process. And then lastly, I spend a lot of my time with family offices. I think that in the previous 10 years, when you would talk with a family office about a long-term strategy, you would talk usually in terms of 50 or maybe 75 years. I currently am working with a family on the notion of the 1,000-year family. And what does it mean to create an investment strategy that's informed by that vision? And if you think about where your family will be in 1,000 years, you in essence become community, you become the village, you become humanity, because the boundaries kind of drop off from this initial set of 4 or 5 individuals to a much, much broader set. And that speaks to this idea of the importance of overcoming the illusion of separation between what's mine and what's yours, and this idea that my profitability can come at your expense and that we can both be okay. We can't. And so we need to just fundamentally rethink our notion of long-termism and how that then informs our understanding of value and the strategies that we execute around in terms of wealth management and how we manage companies and the decisions we make with regard to both.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm busy reading The Good Ancestor, which is kind of that idea as well. How do we become a good ancestor? All right, some other examples? Yes, Stu.
So yeah, Jed, I totally agree. I think B Corp and the whole benefit corporation movement is an important development, and that can cross over into the legal sphere, especially the idea of the formal designation of a benefit corporation as a legal entity. But we would also have to agree that most B Corps have been smaller, kind of niche players, mostly privately held. It's been a very fertile ground for creating acquisition targets by large public companies. But when we ask ourselves the question of how about the large public companies, we still haven't. I think we're still stuck in this mode that we talk about efficiency and product stewardship when it comes to transformation. And so we're not close to getting, the sort of speed of transformation that's going to be required if we have any hope of making it through the knothole. And for that, I think it is going to require government. I spent my entire career trying to figure out how to construct strategies that can operate, without government, assuming government will not, kind of take the reins. But I think it has to, right? I mean, I don't see how we get there quickly enough unless we change the, kind of system constraints and rules of the game. And the one thing I would mention is that's going on in the US that I'm sure probably everyone's familiar with is this Accountable Capitalism Act, that Elizabeth Warren has introduced. I for one think that's a really important, piece, as opposed to not to speak against the, the Green New Deal, but in the U.S., that runs into a lot of kind of ideological resistance, from the right, because it smacks of big government and so forth. But if you take a look at the Accountable Capitalism Act, it's really quite interesting and quite targeted, where the idea is that any corporation, any corporation that's incorporated in the United States in any of the 50 states, if it has sales revenue of more than $1 billion, must get a federal charter. And the federal charter, requires that you actually state what your societal purpose and impact will be and report on it, and a variety of other features, including board composition, including stakeholders on boards and sort of shifting of governance structure. I think it's going to take something like that to really drive this forward. Really
interesting example. Okay, Mark, and then we'll end with you, Rob.
Yeah, so I mean, we do work with a lot of large public companies, and there's some surprising ones like Walmart that are really doing some extraordinary things in the world to create shared value, both for employees as well as environmental impact. Another company is PayPal, which has really found a distinctive competitive positioning through a sense of purpose around democratizing access to financial services, and thereby finding new products and opportunities, particularly for small business and businesses owned by people of color and women that have very little access to traditional credit from the major banks. And I think part of, we have to think back to where the ideas came from. And I think, corporate social responsibility environmental stewardship, et cetera, in many ways sort of grew out of the 60s of a sense of, you know, a set of values that are not just about making money and so on. But when corporate leaders hear it coming out of the sustainability, NGO, social progress, resource generation crowd, they tend to shut it out. And I think part of the virtue of the work that all of us on this call and many others are doing is by framing social good within business school curricula, within the framing of corporate strategy, giving CEOs a way to bring it into their company, to pay attention to it, to use it in a way that they couldn't when it was just CSR and about social responsibility to some segment of the population that cares. And so the reframing, while again, we're marching in the middle of a very large parade, I think has given, in my experience, CEOs a tool that they needed to be able to bring this into practice within their companies. And of course, many companies still are not doing it, but we see many examples of companies embracing it.
Great. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, so I dropped in a site for those, since I've now heard benefit corporations, B Corps, and shareholder wealth. Many of you are familiar with Lynn Stout's work, but this is a bit of an update that is itself getting a little dated now as well. But I encourage you to read that, because especially toward the end, there are some really interesting remarks with regard to benefit corporation statutes in particular that I think have implications. So I'll just leave that there. It turns out that naming specific companies is almost a kiss of death for me. We mentioned Volkswagen positively, and Dieselgate landed between acceptance and page proofs. So I'm not going to name any specific aspirational company lest they fall for that fate. But with that in mind, number one, I just want to say that there's no small value in just stop doing the bad things, right? I'm really looking forward to a time when you no longer have to check your full humanity at the door because it is somehow irrational to have emotions and families and this kind of thing. And so if we would just, you know, start to respect human beings who work for us, that would go a long way, rather than considering them to be sort of human resources, if you will. And then the other thing I'm very interested in watching is how the different companies are attacking or adapting to very similar contexts. So I have a doctoral student, Hussein Fadlallah, and I are watching closely Twitter and Reddit. And I think we could probably throw Facebook in there. It's just too much. But how Twitter and Reddit are dealing with their stakeholder relations are very different. What the models are there, I think, are very different. And I just want to see who gets it right. And so I don't have any skin in the game per se, but I do think that watching them sort of fumble around trying to figure this out, it is very entertaining and I think informative for what future companies in those same spaces will likely do. So I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thank you. And I mean, from my side, of course, like many of you, we're working with or partnering with companies to try and figure out how to make this practical. Port of Antwerp, Johnson & Johnson, BASF, and Randstad. So this is a work in progress. But I do see signs of some companies that really take this on board. I mean, we've been doing a retrospective on Interface. I mean, they're such a classic, but I think they haven't lost their ambition to be truly sustainable or restorative. They keep upping the game. I'm inspired by companies like Ørsted now, that has gone from being a fossil fuel company to being nearly 100% renewable now within the space of about 10 years. So, I mean, I think there are examples out there. I'd like to respect everybody's time, so I'm going to really just thank you all, and it's been enjoyable. We did a little bit of the aerial maneuvering, as well as hopefully something a little bit closer to the ground, and to thank everybody who also joined us on this call and contributed your comments and your questions. just to say that one of the things, together with ABIS, thank you for co-hosting with us, that we're planning to do, we would like to do, also with your permission, besides sharing the recording of this, is to look back at the two dialogues and probably the practical ones that we've had as well, and just shape up some kind of a paper out of it to see are there any threads or themes that have come out, any questions that we've raised that we think could be usefully summarized in some kind of a paper. So I'll share that with you as we make progress on that. So once again, thank you all. I will bring it to a close there, and stay safe, get better for those of you who have the need for that, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue in many other ways.
Thanks, Wayne.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
Bye.